Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Grandma Stories channel. I'm your storyteller, here to share powerful life stories about kindness, humanity, and the quiet strength of people we often overlook. Before we begin today's story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you meaningful stories. The rain began just as the old woman reached the restaurant door. Drops rolled slowly down the glass windows, blurring the bright lights inside. Through the foggy reflection, she could see people laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating life. But she stood outside for a moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the door handle. Her coat was thin, faded by years of use. The edges were worn. Her shoes were old, but carefully polished. She took a quiet breath and stepped inside. The room felt strangely quiet, not completely silent, but quiet enough that several people noticed her. A young waiter raised an eyebrow. She slowly walked toward an empty table near the window. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 79 years old, and she had not eaten in a restaurant for nearly 15 years. The waiter approached reluctantly, holding his notebook. "Ma'am, this restaurant is quite expensive, ma'am. This restaurant is quite expensive," he said cautiously. Margaret gave him a gentle smile. "I know, dear," she replied softly. "May I see the menu?" At the nearby table, one of the men chuckled loudly. "Maybe she thinks this is a soup kitchen," he whispered to his friends. They laughed. Margaret heard them. Of course she did. Old age doesn't make people deaf to cruelty, but she said nothing. The waiter placed the menu down slowly, still unsure. Margaret studied the menu carefully. Her eyes moved slowly over the prices. Steak, seafood, wine. Everything was far more expensive than most people would spend on dinner. Finally, she closed the menu. "I would like the steak dinner, please," she said calmly. The waiter blinked in surprise. The steak?" he repeated. "Yes, dear." The men at the nearby table burst into laughter again. "Someone better make sure she can pay for that," one of them joked. Another added loudly, "Maybe she'll wash dishes after." More laughter. The waiter looked uncomfortable now. Margaret reached into her purse. From inside, she removed a neatly folded cloth handkerchief, and beneath it, an old leather wallet. She placed it calmly on the table. "Yes," she said gently. "I'm quite sure." The waiter hesitated, then nodded and walked away. Margaret turned her gaze toward the rain outside. The sound of laughter continued behind her. But she remained calm, because this was not the first time people had judged her, and she suspected it wouldn't be the last. 20 minutes later, the food arrived. The steak was placed carefully in front of her. Steam rose from the plate. Margaret looked at it quietly, almost thoughtfully. For a moment she didn't eat. Instead, she whispered something under her breath. A prayer. Then she took her first bite. Across the room, the men continued watching her. One of them shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "People like her shouldn't come to places like this." "Relax. She'll probably get kicked out when the bill comes." They laughed again. But the owner of the restaurant had just entered the room. His name was Daniel Carter. He was a tall man in his early 40s, known for running one of the finest restaurants in the city. As he greeted customers, his eyes eventually fell on the old woman sitting quietly by the window. Something about her seemed familiar. He watched her carefully, the way she sat, the way she folded her napkin, the way she looked out the window between bites. A strange feeling tugged at his memory. Then one of the waiters leaned toward him. "Sir," the waiter whispered, "that old lady ordered the steak, but I'm not sure she can pay." Daniel frowned slightly. "Why would you assume that?" "Well, look at her clothes." Daniel glanced again. Yes, her coat was old. Yes, her shoes were worn. But something about her posture told a different story. He slowly walked toward her table. For a moment, their eyes met, and suddenly, Daniel froze. His face went pale. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "is your name Margaret?" Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Yes," she replied gently. "Margaret Hale." Daniel's eyes widened. The entire room watched as the restaurant owner suddenly stepped forward, and to everyone's shock, he knelt beside her chair. The room fell completely silent. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice trembling, You probably don't remember me." Margaret studied his face carefully, her eyes softened. "Daniel," she asked, "you were the boy who washed dishes here 25 years ago." Daniel smiled weakly. "Yes." One of the men at the nearby table leaned forward, confused. "What's going on?" he whispered. Daniel stood slowly and turned toward the room. "You see this woman?" he said. "When I was 17, I had nothing. No money, no family support, no future." He looked back at Margaret. "I worked in this very building when it was just every night after my shift. I sat outside because I couldn't afford dinner." The room remained silent. Daniel continued. "And every night, this woman came out and handed me a warm meal." Margaret waved her hand gently. "It was nothing." But Daniel shook his head. "No, it was everything." He looked around the restaurant. "She paid for my meals for almost a year. She told me one thing I never forgot." He turned back to her. "You said kindness is an investment. Someday it returns." Margaret smiled quietly. "Well, it seems it did." The men who had laughed earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable. Daniel straightened his jacket and addressed the waiter. "Tonight, Mrs. Hale's dinner is on the house." Margaret shook her head immediately. "Oh no, dear. I insist on paying." But Danny smiled warmly. "Then allow me to repay a very small part of what you gave me." He paused, then added softly, "And if anyone in this room laughs at her again, they can leave my restaurant." The men at the corner table suddenly found their plates very interesting. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Margaret finished her meal peacefully. When she stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. The rain had stopped. The streetlights reflected softly on the wet pavement. "Mrs. Hale," Daniel said gently, "I want you to come here anytime you wish. You will always have a seat in this restaurant." Margaret looked up at the glowing sign above the door. Then she smiled. "You know, Daniel, people laughed at me tonight. But that's all right. Because sometimes the world laughs before it learns the truth." And before walking away, she added one final sentence. "Never judge a life by its clothes, only by its kindness." Daniel watched her disappear slowly down the quiet street. And inside the restaurant, no one laughed anymore. And before walking away, she added one final sentence. "Never judge a life by its clothes, only by its kindness." Daniel watched her disappear slowly down the quiet street. And inside the restaurant, no one laughed anymore. Moral of the story: sometimes the people the world laughs at are the ones who quietly change someone's life forever. True wealth is not money, it's the kindness we leave behind. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful grandma stories. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story.